Welcome back to another edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, I am joined by Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter for the Chronicle, Telegram, Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownZone.com. Scott, as always, a pleasure to be joined alongside you here on Thanksgiving week, and a big week for the Browns, celebrating a victory over the Dolphins on Sunday, and more importantly, we'll dive into this a little bit later on, staring down the barrel of a huge matchup against those Pittsburgh Steelers on Sunday. Scott, how are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you doing?
So far, so good. Enjoying the beginning of a very busy work week here, and a very busy week for the Browns as well as they get ready for the Steelers. But, Scott, let's focus our attention here at the beginning of the podcast on the victory against the Dolphins on Sunday, a game going in where everybody kind of thought that the Browns would win. Offensively, they were very balanced. They look very, very good. Scott, what were your three major takeaways in that win over Miami?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the fact that the Browns came out focused enough, and maybe I made too big a deal of it in my own mind, but I was concerned about how they would handle with 10 days worth of distractions, and it's not just normal distractions, right? I mean, distractions has kind of become this catch-all word and term, but there was a lot going on around this team, right? With the Myles Garrett with the Myles Garrett indefinite suspension, with the accusations of the racial slur against Mason Rudolph. There was a lot of non-football discussion for 10 days. And with Miami being Miami, I wasn't sure if the Browns would come in with enough focus. And I think they did. You know, they had a little lull in the third quarter. But overall, they came out really hot, finished strong. So I thought that was impressive. And I think that Freddie Kitchens deserves a nod for having his team ready to play. My second takeaway, I'm going to go with Baker Mayfield, who he threw a pick, which ended his streak of 157 passes without an interception. But to me, played his fourth good game in a row. If we're counting Denver, he'd gone 3 straight games without a pick. And I see him continuing to trend in the right direction. And that's necessary, right? If this team is going to make any push at the playoffs, which they've started to make a little bit of a push here, Baker Mayfield needs to play really well. And that feeds into my third takeaway, which is it's kind of like the offense looked like we thought it would look for most of the season. Now, Kareem Hunt's only been back 3 games, but when you add Kareem Hunt and you throw 2 touchdown passes to Jarvis Landry and he has 10 catches for 148, and Odell Beckham Jr. catches a long touchdown and gets in the end zone for the first time since week 2, and Hunt scores, and Chubb scores, that's what we expected. Now, it was against Miami, and Miami's beat up, and they have no pass rush, and their secondary was decimated. But it kind of gave you a glimpse of what this team might be able to do moving forward, and it's going to be key because when we talked about this last week, and we're going to talk about it for the rest of the season, without Myles Garrett, the defense isn't going to be the same, and this offense is going to have to carry more weight.
Yeah, they're going to have to shoulder most of the load. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, you mentioned there about how, yes, it was against Miami, and that has to be brought up, not to discount anything that they did offensively. Look, they did what we thought on paper going into that game that they would do. How much of that success do you think can be counted for them finally getting into some kind of a rhythm, or how much of it do you think has to do with the Dolphins just being the Dolphins, as bad as they've been this year?
Well, you can't take the Dolphins out of the equation because – and, you know, they had won 2 out of the last 3. But when you look at that roster, it's not a good roster. And when you look at the pass rush, it's a terrible pass rush. I think they had 13 sacks entering the game. So you knew Baker was going to have time to throw. They put both starting safeties, on IR that week. One of their starting corners didn't make the trip because he had an injury. So the Browns should have done what they did. But it's still an NFL game. You still have to go and do it. We've seen plenty of games where the Browns have the edge in a matchup and they don't go and perform and meet expectations. So, like I said, I don't want to take Miami out of the equation, but I get frustrated sometimes when people talk about an NFL game and dismiss it because of the opponent. Teams lose to bad teams all the time. Right? The Colts lost to the Dolphins 2 weeks ago, and the Colts are close to being a playoff team. Yes, they didn't have their starting quarterback, but still, they went and lost. Miami beat the Jets, I want to say, and the Jets have won 3 in a row since then. So each week needs to be taken on its own, and the fact that the Browns played as well as they did overall, I think is a good sign regardless of the opponent.
Focusing on this offense just a little bit more here, because you've got to celebrate the fact that this offense is finally starting to look like the unit we thought it would look like at the beginning of the year. You've talked extensively about the play of Baker Mayfield the last few weeks, even when it looked like to some people maybe he wasn't turning the corner. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you thought he turned that corner in that Patriots game, which, of course, was another game where they didn't play all that well as a team, but you thought you saw him turning the corner there. Scott, he really kind of has been the difference maker, and he's in a position here where there's lots of hungry mouths to feed in that offense, and it seemed like he was able to distribute the wealth a little bit on Sunday.
Yeah, you're right about that last point, for sure. Able to get the ball to a lot of different people, but specifically, and I want to focus on the two main guys, right? Jarvis, Landry, and Odell Beckham Jr. We've talked about them forever, and first time all season, they both scored a touchdown, right? It's the first time they've scored a touchdown in the same game since they were teammates at LSU, which makes sense because they started their NFL careers with other teams. But we were game 11. And to think that they wouldn't have had a touchdown together until game 11, I wouldn't have made that bet. To think that Odell would have gone from week 2 with that 89-yard catch and run against the Jets until week 12, because of the bye week, without having a touchdown, that's an 8-game drought without a touchdown, the longest of his career. I wouldn't have thought that was possible. So I think that's huge that Baker has found some kind of rhythm with these guys. And now it's still not perfect. We still see the slant where he throws behind Odell, and it could just be a bad throw. It could be their timing's off still, and it turns into an interception. But I like where it's going. Those guys are going to have to be key for this team to do what it wants to do. And I do think you have to take into account the Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb factor. The defenses are going to have to pay more attention to those guys, and that should open things up downfield. And if it doesn't, if defenses say, no, we're taking away the deep threats, then Chubb and Hunt are going to have field days. And we saw a little bit of that against Miami, because not that I'm noticing every snap, but when I would notice Miami playing the two deep safeties, which means you can't have 8 in a box, the Browns ran it often, and Nick Chubb had success, and Kareem Hunt had some success. And I think that's a dilemma moving forward for defensive coordinators, how they're going to approach all these weapons. And to talk about Baker, I thought he started to turn that corner against New England. He played a much better game, in my opinion, in not ideal circumstances. And I do think we have to remember that he faced a string of really difficult defenses, right? Seattle's got a good defense. The Rams have a good defense. New England, even Baltimore, Buffalo, Denver. I mean, they all have big-time Steelers, all have legitimate defenses, top 10, top 12 kind of defenses. So it was never going to be easy for Baker to have a bunch of big numbers. And now when the schedule lets off a little bit with the Miami, with the Cincinnatis, maybe you'll see those numbers kind of come back to where we thought they would be. And it's not all about numbers. I thought he played great against the Steelers on that Thursday night, and he didn't have outstanding numbers. But I loved his composure. I liked his presence in the pocket. And I think he's made big strides in a couple of key areas, and that's limiting turnovers and moving inside the pocket but not bailing out. And we talked about this. In the beginning of the season, I thought he did that way too much, and I know he's been way better at that recently, and I think there's a direct correlation there with the success he's having and the success the offense has started to have. It's still not there completely. Even with the 40 points, Baker said we left stuff out there, but it's getting a lot closer.
Yes, certainly is, and well, we're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk about this offense because there are so many dynamic players and so many storylines surrounding it. Let's take a look at the other side of the ball here. All right, Joe Schobert, back-to-back weeks with a couple of picks. In addition to that, moving Sheldon Richardson to the outside here because the Browns are going to have to get creative. They're not going to have Myles Garrett again for the rest of this season, and of course they're dinged up with a few other defensive ends, and of course with the Ogunjobi missing the game also, they had to get creative against the Dolphins. But defensively, this is going to be really interesting moving forward. You think that Sheldon Richardson playing on the outside is something that could be a little more permanent moving forward?
Well, I think it's a wrinkle, and I think it's part of a package when they want to go big, when they think the other team's going to run or the other team goes double tight end, something like that. That's how it started out, and I think it'll eventually work back there when Olivier Vernon is back. For now, I think Richardson can play some more snaps there. What's interesting today, and talk about breaking news, as I'm driving here to do this podcast, Andy, the Browns cut Devereaux Lawrence, who had started the last two games at defensive tackle. Now, part of that move is Larry Ogunjobi is coming back from suspension, so they needed to create a roster spot. But obviously, it's not that simple. You could have created a roster spot other ways. I don't know if it's strictly he had 2 games to start. The Browns didn't like how he played, so therefore swap him out. I don't know if there's a bigger thing, if there's a secret reason that we're going to come to find out later. I called and asked, and I was told no, but, you never know. And I think it also could signal an impending return of Olivier Vernon, because if Vernon's back and Ogunjobi's back, then you can slide Richardson inside more permanently again, and that decreases the need for Devereaux Lawrence to play as many snaps as he'd been playing. And they really like Eli Ankou, a guy that they just picked up a few weeks back. So definitely a surprising move. Hopefully, for the Browns' sake, it signals the return of Olivier Vernon, because then they're always going to miss Myles Garrett. But if you have Vernon back, and you have Ogunjobi back, and you have Richardson playing at a high level, then you can figure out ways to compensate for Myles Garrett, or at least to try to compensate for the loss of Myles Garrett. But against Miami, missing 3 of those starters, you couldn't do it. And I know they finished with 4 sacks, but Ryan Fitzpatrick had time. It was a struggle, and Freddie Kitchens admitted it. It was a struggle to get a pass rush, and hopefully that will change given a healthy or close to healthy Olivier Vernon, and then a Larry Ogunjobi coming back from the suspension.
You surprised at what this defensive line looks like right now? Because going back to one of the first shows that we did, you had mentioned that while the receivers are going to get a lot of attention as perhaps the most talented the most talented unit on the team, that defensive line really stood out to you. You talked about all the names on that list going into training camp, and you look at that unit now, it is totally different. They've lost some pretty big names along the way.
Yeah, they really have. And obviously Myles is the signature guy on that line. So for the rest of the season, there's not going to be a Myles, and then you have to figure out how does this defensive line overcome that. But last week when you looked out there, without Ogunjobi, without Vernon, who's now missed 3 straight games, it looked nothing like we expected. We expected a dominant pass rush. We expected the potential for 4 Pro Bowlers, right? Not that they were all going to make it, but Vernon, Garrett, Richardson had all been to Pro Bowls. Larry Ogunjobi feels to me like a borderline Pro Bowl guy. He's got 5 sacks from the interior, which isn't easy to do. So he finishes with 8. That's going to be among the league leaders at D tackle. So, when you take a step back and you look at what has happened to this line, it's disappointing and it's unfortunate, but it also speaks to depth. And if you're going to have depth at positions, D-line is one you need, a bunch of depth, because guys get hurt, because you got to rotate guys in and out. And then secondary. And we've seen both position groups get tested this year. And I do think John Dorsey, who's gotten some criticism for the first time in his Browns tenure recently, just with some of the moves he's had to make, Antonio Callaway, Jermaine Whitehead, those kind of things, trading Jannard Avery and Austin Corbett. But I do think he deserves credit for the fact that he stockpiled talented depth in the secondary and at the D-line, and he's needed it at both places. Now, obviously, there's a drop-off when you have 3 or 4 starters out, but he's been able to find bodies, and even more impressive maybe is in the secondary, where they played 4 weeks without Greedy and Denzel, and they were able to overcome. Now they're down 3 of their quote-unquote starting safeties, right? 3 out of the top 4 safeties were gone, and they're still figuring out a way to do it. So it speaks to depth, and it also speaks to in-season moves, right? When he claimed Justin Burris off waivers, the safety, and he came in and started 48 hours later against the Rams. Eli Ankou is a mid-season pickup. Like some of these, Brian Cox, who started his high school career at Avon and played against Miami and showed some things against Miami. These guys are all mid-season pickups that we could look back at the end and go, hey, these guys made a difference.
Yeah, and that certainly can't be overlooked, especially at that spot where they've endured a great deal of change for one reason or another. All right, well, we've got to address the elephant in the room, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers waiting in the wings, and This one means a lot. I mean, we can always talk about the storyline, the aftermath of what went down about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks ago now. And I think what kind of gets lost in that is the magnitude of this game. This was obviously a huge rivalry. About 20 years ago, it certainly meant a ton. You could make the argument that over the last 10 or 15 years, it hasn't meant as much because the Browns haven't been nearly as good. But now you've got the Steelers angling for a playoff spot. The Browns are doing the exact same thing. Safe to say that in the history of this rivalry, this is the biggest game in this rivalry in the last decade, maybe decade and a half?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say. I haven't done all my research for the week, but I'm pretty sure the Browns haven't. I'm going to sound like an idiot here, but I don't think the Browns have swept them since they've been back. I'm going to have to double-check that. Because maybe the Tim Couch here, when they went to Pittsburgh, maybe they did. But, I mean, Big Ben's record has been so good. It's been at least 15 years, right? I know they haven't since Big Ben got to the Steelers in 2004. I think back, 2002, right, when they went up to Pittsburgh and lost the playoff game that they should have won, is probably the latest game that had this much riding on it and this much anticipation. Obviously, the return in 99, and we all know how that ended. And there's been different games along the line, but it's been a long time for sure. When Pittsburgh has dominated the way they have, and the Browns have been as bad as they've been, there's been this rivalry has lost some of its luster. One of my buddies in the office yesterday said, we're calling it a rivalry again. And to me, it never lost it because it was always Pittsburgh-Cleveland. But I get that sentiment. I get that it didn't have the same allure, and it certainly didn't have the same ramifications when they met up because one team was playing for nothing and the other team was playing for a playoff spot. So there's a lot on the line here, and there would be for a normal Pittsburgh-Cleveland game where both teams are in the wild card hunt, right? The Browns are getting there. I'm writing an analysis today where I wasn't going to talk about the Browns in the playoffs until they got to 500. But I'm breaking my own rule at 5-6 because they're a game back of the second wild card spot. If they beat Pittsburgh, then they have a lot of momentum. They're right there. The worst they would be is a game back with 4 to play, and that's definitely within striking distance. Now, if they lose to Pittsburgh, they're 2 back with 4 to play, and not that it's impossible, but it would be a real long shot to me from a tiebreaker perspective, they still have to play Baltimore, they still have to go to Arizona. Are we confident they're going to go 4-0? Those kinds of things. It's a huge game. And first of all, you can't fall behind Pittsburgh by 2 games with 4 to play. It's a lot of ground to make up in a short amount of time. And that's just on the field. Then we have everything off of it. And it's the brawl. And it's the suspensions. And it's Myles Garrett. And it's the accusation against Mason Rudolph. And then it's Mason Rudolph being benched, and he's not going to start Sunday. And it's going to be Devlin Hodges. And I think that takes some of the potential for ugliness on the field away because Rudolph was out there, and you have these Browns guys that are loyal to Myles Garrett. You'd hope nobody takes any extra cheap shots, but you just don't know. If it's out there and it's in their heads that Rudolph said something to Garrett, I think that takes one of these issues away. But that doesn't diminish the game, and it's still going to be an intense game. Fans are still going to be fired up, and I don't know if concerned is too strong, but I'm a little bit concerned about how that atmosphere is going to be inside the stadium for Browns fans. I think on the field might be safer than in the stands, in the crowd, just because the officials are going to call it tight, and I think anything that's close to a headshot, anything that's close to after the whistle, we're going to see penalties early, and the guys are going to have to be on their best behavior. And I'm not sure you can say the same thing for the stands. But yeah, so it's a long answer for this is a huge game. There's so much to talk about and write about and think about heading into this game, even before you get to individual matchups, like Larry Ogunjobi versus the backup center because Pouncey's still suspended, right? Hodges, who hasn't played very much against this defense. No Myles Garrett. All of it. And this is the first time the Browns, they opened as a 1-point favorite, according to Bet Online. Now they're a 2-point favorite. They haven't been a favorite in Pittsburgh since 1989. right?
Wow.
So it just shows you where the state of the franchises have been. And that year, I'm pretty sure it was the opener, and the Browns went up there and won 51-0. And they were coming off the back-to-back, AFC Championship appearances, or 2 out of 3 AFC Championship appearances. So a lot at stake, huge game, and it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. It would also be a huge boost for the Browns' momentum, right? 4 in a row with 2 wins over Pittsburgh in that span would be probably, unprecedented or a long time coming, versus if you see your 3-game losing streak end at Pittsburgh to Devlin Duck Hodges, it might be tough to recover from that.
What do you make of the time change? Because so much of the game's popularity these days is based on when you play, when you kick, and how that's dictated by television networks. And obviously the NFL had their hand in that as well. What do you make of them moving the time of the kickoff for this one?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And not to be Mr. Conspiracy guy, but I think there were 2 elements in there. I think one, I believe it was the Chiefs-Oakland game, got flexed out to 4:25. And at the time, the Browns were 4-6. Pittsburgh was struggling. Oakland had just come off a big win. And that was a better matchup. It still probably is a better matchup. It's Chiefs-Oakland. 2 teams with winning records, 2 teams in playoff position. I think the second part of that is, let's take this highly anticipated matchup, and we're talking days after the brawl, right? Maybe hours after the brawl when they made the decision. Let's take it out of the spotlight. And if I were the NFL, which is consumed by public relations, I might have done the same thing. I understand you want as many eyes as possible on all your games, but I think I would want fewer eyes on this game in case something happened anywhere similar to that, what happened on that Thursday night brawl.
That makes perfect sense. Well, and that leads us, into a little more in-depth analysis here on Sunday when you take on a guy that, hasn't taken many snaps this year. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing, because the Browns don't have much of a book, as they say, on Hodges, and they know what to expect from Rudolph. Maybe don't know as much what to expect from Hodges. So again, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Well, I would agree with that. And Sheldon Richardson, the Browns D tackle, said it best after the game. Somebody asked him about Rudolph being benched, and he said, "I really don't care." And then he couldn't help himself. Somebody started asking another question. He goes, "I hope he," and I'm paraphrasing, but "I hope he plays. I hope he plays." Why? Didn't you see the last game? So fresh in the Browns players' memories, fresh in the fans' memories, is Rudolph throwing 4 picks. Right before the last 8 seconds, he threw 4 picks and didn't look like he belonged. Now, I thought he played better in games preceding that. Now, he hadn't won any games. Like, when I say he hadn't won any games, Pittsburgh's defense had been carrying the load. Minka Fitzpatrick was scoring every week. So Rudolph was just needed to manage the game, and when he needed to score points against the Browns because they got up early, he couldn't do it. And I'm not sure he's capable of doing it. And then he goes into Cincinnati, and, it's only human for him to be rattled coming off everything that happened with the Browns. The fight, the picks, the Myles Garrett racial slur accusation. I mean, all that's playing in this young quarterback's head, and he goes into Cincinnati and doesn't play well early. And I went back and watched that game, and he just didn't look comfortable. He held the ball in the pocket for a long time. There were a bunch of plays where he's getting dragged down and he's trying to throw the ball away, and there had to be 3 or 4 plays where you were questioning, is that intentional grounding or not? Did his knee hit the ground? Like, he just didn't look comfortable at all. And obviously Mike Tomlin saw the same thing and made the switch, and Devlin Hodges comes in, and he wins 16-10. Devlin Hodges threw 1 big pass. He had one guy, he had a deep over route to James Washington, catches it. Cincinnati's defensive backs can't tackle him, and he scores a touchdown, and that's it. I'm not sure Hodges. I think Hodges might have made one more throw where I'd be, oh, that's a good throw. And that was it. And I'm not, if you're the Browns, I don't think you go into the game thinking Devlin Hodges is going to beat you. Even if, Juju Smith-Schuster comes back. And it doesn't sound like James Conner is going to come back. And Smith-Schuster, it's so unpredictable with the concussion protocol. We're going to have to wait and see. But even if he had all his pieces, I don't think Devin Hodges is going to beat you. So then it's incumbent on the Browns to not beat themselves. And you know Pittsburgh is going to play good defense. But if you can get a lead if you're the Browns, if you can protect the ball if you're the Browns, if you can, as an offense, is a talented offense, more talented than Pittsburgh's offense, if you can put up 20 points and not turn the ball over and not give the Steelers 7 points on defense by throwing a pick to Rudolph or letting T.J. Watt get a strip sack for a touchdown, something like that, then I'm comfortable, if you're the Browns, saying, Devin Hodges, go put up 21 against us. Even without Myles Garrett, I'm not sure he can do that.
All right, we'll close it out on this, Scott. Are there two matchups in this game that stand out to you? Are there two particular marquee matchups in your mind for Sunday's game?
I'm going to go with, and I mentioned it briefly a little bit earlier, without Pouncey in there, they have the backup center. And you got Sheldon Richardson and you got Larry Ogunjobi. And Pouncey's a Pro Bowl player. And without Garrett, I think that's where the defensive line has a chance to win, is in the interior. And if you can get to any quarterback in the middle, especially a young quarterback, I think that's how they have a chance to make a big impression and kind of take things over and not let Hodges get any kind of rhythm. And the second matchup I would go with is, I mean, there's so many, but I'm going to go. I'm debating whether or not to go with Chris Hubbard at right tackle versus T.J. Watt, because Watt has a chance to wreck a game. And I thought Hubbard played pretty well against him in that Thursday night matchup. But you go on the road, it's loud, you get that pause before, you get your first step back. Watt has an edge. It's going to be a tougher matchup for Hubbard. But having said all that, I'm going to go with Joe Hayden versus those Browns receivers, right? The former Browns cornerback. Joe's played well, and he's still playing at a high level. He's still making a ton of money. But he doesn't run like he used to, right? He's been in the league since 2010. 2010. So I think he's susceptible to a double move. He plays a lot with his eyes in the backfield, right? And kind of has a feel for what patterns, what routes the receivers are running. And I think if the Browns can give Baker time and set it up, they can get Odell on a slant and go or a hook and go, some kind of double move and make a big play to take advantage of Joe Hayden's aggressiveness. And I think that's the kind of play that could change a game, which I think on the surface we think is going to be close, right? The Browns are 2-point favorites. The expectation is it's going to be close, and it's going to be a 17-13, 17-14 type of game. And if you can make one big play, a 55-yard touchdown pass, it changes the landscape. And I think that potential is there with the receivers versus Joe Hayden in particular.
Should be a good one on Sunday, no question about it. Scott, as always, a pleasure, my friend. Happy Thanksgiving to you and yours, and we'll do this again next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Scott. Again, that's Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownsZone.com. That's going to wrap up this edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we will talk to all of you again next week. And next week.